And you want the revolution to play, correct?
We were doing Break Every Chain, the beginning, and then the end was Revolution. Yeah.
Got you like Tasha. Tasha Cobbs. I pray my internet act right. Okay, here we go. Oh, it's not gonna work.
Good evening, brothers and sisters, and welcome once again to Earth Week with the Black Christian Leaders Coalition. We're so glad that you joined us. We want to thank those of you who have been with us Sunday night with Deacon Frank Figures, and then Monday night with Bishop Thomas Jenkins, last night with yours truly, Leo Woodbury, and tonight we're going to have a really action-packed and very educational and enlightening man of God come to us and to share with us the history of the Black church and how that fits in with our struggles for social justice, particularly today. And wow, what other time better than now than to have this discussion after the verdict in Minnesota, but then also the tragic shooting of the 16-year-old girl in Columbus, Ohio, while we were yet still waiting for a verdict. And so to give us the perspective from the Black church and from our written word and scripture, we have none other than Minister Malik Saafir. Minister Malik Saafir is with Poetic Justice in Little Rock, Arkansas, and he's been with us through the Justice First Tour and so many other projects and programs. And without any further ado, we're going to bring him forward so that he can fill our hearts, our minds, and our souls with the history and with the vigor and the vision of the Black church, and give us an idea about where we go from here. And so, Minister Saafir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Reverend Woodbury. It is once again an honor to be a part of this tremendous panel that has, in many ways, facilitated an entire week's conversation about what is the role of the Black church in relationship to environmental justice, as well as economic justice in the Black community. So I was asked to present on a topic that really deals with the history of the movement. I know we dealt with at the beginning of the week and even up until yesterday, a very powerful demonstration of where we are now in the movement. But I want to take a Sankofa moment. And I want us to return to the beginning of the Black church here in America so that we can understand how we arrived at this place, looking backwards so that we can again look forward. So in order to do so, I'm going to share a presentation that I did just to give a visual history of the Black church's journey or sojourn in America and fighting for civil rights as well as human rights. So I'm going to share my screen with you all so you can kind of see and look at what I'm looking at as we kind of walk through this conversation together. 1 second, please. So you all should be able to now see, everyone sees the presentation there?
Mhm.
Okay. So once again, my name is Minister Malik Saafir, and the title of this presentation is Black Liberation Theology and Environmental Racism. And so the first thing I want to do is kind of take us back to the origins of Black liberation theology. So the questions we want to answer during this time together is, what is environmental racism? What is Black liberation theology? And then how is environmental racism connected to Black Christian Leaders Coalition? So first of all, Black liberation theology is a term that's been really used in higher education, and many of your pastors or any layperson who has read literature on the Black church and its revolutionary struggle since the 1960s may have come across this term, Black liberation theology. But basically, Black liberation theology was basically saying to those in seminaries, divinity schools, as well as in philosophy and religion departments throughout in the country, what Black liberation theology means to us is that we connect the experiences of oppressed people in the Bible to the experiences of Black people locally and globally. So then what is environmental racism? Environmental racism basically is saying to us then and now, where we live matters, our place matters, and where we're positioned in the society, where they build our homes, our schools, our hospitals, our clinics, what jobs we're able to have access to, and where we're able to have leisure time and play, as well as our churches, where we're able to build our churches, were all determined by the color of our skin. So environmental racism is the experience of racism in places where we live, learn, heal, work, play, and pray. So the connection, Black liberation theology, environmental racism is connected over time. We began to talk about Black liberation theology as a concept that the Black church has always used during the abolition of slavery movement, during the abolition of Jim Crow movement, as well as during the abolition of what we call now the new Jim Crow movement. And so this has been with us as a tradition, as a point of reflection about what does liberation mean for Black people in the times that we live through from slavery into now. So I want to give you a little history of environmental racism from then to now to kind of show how where we live matter, where we learn matter, where we work matter, where we heal matter, where we play matters, as well as where we pray matters. And this to me, this is just my interpretation, this is what it means when we say Black Lives Matter. If you are someone who believes that Black lives matter, then you should also believe that Black lives matter where we live in our homes. Black lives matter where we learn in our schools. Black lives matter where we work, on our job. Black lives matter where we heal in our hospitals and clinics. And for those of us who believe in natural indigenous ways of healing, in the hearts and minds of those who are our practitioners that goes beyond what the doctors and nurses say. And then also Black Lives Matter wherever we find times to experience fun, recreation, leisure with our family. Church way to come together where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. In those spaces where we pray, Black lives also matter. And so the first thing I want to do is highlight Black liberation theology from the context of slavery. So the abolition of racial slavery was what I call the first civil war in America. between those who came and colonized these lands who were British, and they began to decide how they wanted to deal with Black bodies during the time of slavery. So in order to understand what environmental racism is, we have to ask the questions, where did slaves live? Where did slaves learn? Where did slaves work? Where did slaves heal? Where did slaves play? And then also, where did slaves pray? So in order to illustrate this visually, I wanted to kind of share with you some images from a famous movie that came out recently called 12 Years a Slave. And in that movie, we begin to see images of the environmental conditions in which slaves live through the lens of this particular movie about Solomon Northup. So the images were shown in this movie is the conditions of where the slaves live and how slaves were put in quarters that were inferior in some respects to where the master lived. Where the slaves learn. We saw in the movie how Solomon struggled to hide the fact he had to learn in secret in the South and share his knowledge in secret because it was a crime to learn as slaves. Where did slaves work? Well, you know, in the South, we worked in the field, we worked in factories, we worked in industrial sites. And then where did we heal? Well, slaves healed through natural and sometimes indigenous healing methods after they endured physical hardships. And this is an image of Solomon having to whip another slave, of how slaves had to deal with, one, the trauma to their physical bodies, as well as how to heal from their physical bodies. And then slaves had to also deal with where they prayed. We have an image here of Solomon's master teaching them the Bible. Now, how many of you can guess? He didn't go to that master didn't go to the passage in the Bible where they talked about liberation, freedom. That master normally went to the parts of the Bible that talked about how to be a good slave. So Blacks had to learn during this time how to listen for the things that meant freedom and how to ignore the things that meant oppression. And then whether they play. Sometimes we were exploited for our gifts and talents of entertainment to entertain the master and his colleagues. And other times we found times in secret to pray and to play and to have a connection to God as well as to our own family and friends. So there is a Black liberation theology that was born out of slavery. And we know that it existed because we call Harriet Tubman the Black Moses. Moses is a name that originates from the Bible. And the story of Moses leading the people out of Israel was a fitting image of what Harriet Tubman was doing when she helped lead slaves through the Underground Railroad. Black liberation theology also, and this is my reading, also referred to figures during that time such as Sojourner Truth, who I would call the Black Aaron type, who was the one who spoke with powerful words about ending slavery, used her words to speak about justice and liberation the same way Aaron during the time of Moses. You see why they're the Black Moses and the Black Aaron. Used his words to help Moses, who said he had a speech problem, to learn how to deal with the injustices that they faced in Egypt. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the carrying on of this tradition from slavery now into Jim Crow. So in environmental racism, we always come back to the question of where do you live? I'm sorry. One second. I got messages coming in. Where do you learn? Where do you pray? Where do you heal? And where do you play? And so these particular things become evident when we talk about the Jim Crow era and what we had to face, our ancestors had to face as it relates to Black Lives Mattering. And so I want to take us through a visual image of the Jim Crow era as our next topic of discussion, and why Black Lives Matter in that era as it relates to environmental racism as well as slavery. I'm so sorry. I'm having some technical difficulties. All right, there we go. All right, so we talked about slavery and the Solomon story and journey through slavery. Now I want to talk about the Jim Crow era. So Jim Crow laws were passed after we came out of the period of slavery into what we thought was the beginning of a new America. But that new America made us realize quickly that they had a difficult time accepting slaves who were once slave being freed and enjoying the rights of everyday Americans who were non-Black. And so what we began to experience was environmental racism coming out of the slave quarters into now the beyond the slave quarters into the rest of the American society. So we have to ask the question then, did the condition of Negroes change from when they came out of slavery into other areas of America? They began to segregate Negroes based on where they lived. We had separate housing. Then where we learned, we had separate schools. Then where we were able to work, there were only jobs limiting our ability to have a decent living wage, as well as we had separate hospitals and doctors and nurses to care for our families and our friends. This also led to a segregation in the continuation of a segregation in the church. Blacks were once worshiping with their slave masters and families, but then after slavery, Blacks began to set up their own churches and began to worship separately from whites, and whites began to use their own understanding of the nature of a slave religion to bring terror to Black folk throughout America. And now you see an image of the KKK with a message behind saying, Jesus saves. And then we had separate theaters, separate parks, separate playgrounds, which was a continuation of the separate slave quarters that we had during chattel slavery. And then we had a new emergence in Black liberation theology of what is called Black Moses again, who came in the presence of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in this phase of what I'm calling the Second Civil War. And we also had another powerful spokesperson who I'm calling the Black Aaron of that movement, and that is Ella Baker. And in this second phase of our Civil War, because we're still fighting for racial equality, the Black figures of this time began to embody or reimagine what it meant for people who lived during the time of slavery to ask God, to appeal to God for freedom, and what it means now during this era of the Civil Rights Movement for Black people to continue to petition God to intervene to help them find their freedom in America. And so we have the chattel slavery movement, anti-chattel slavery movement, the abolitionist movement of racial slavery. We had the abolitionist movement of racial Jim Crow during what we call the rise of the Civil Rights Movement. And then we have a third phase of the Civil War, which is where we are now under the new Jim Crow banner. And this asks the same questions today as our ancestors have asked for 2 or more periods in our generations of fighting for civil rights. And that is, Where do Black people live today? Where do Black people live? Where do they learn today? Where do Black people work today? Where do Black people heal today? And where do Black people play today? As well as where do Black people pray today? Now, the answer to these questions will determine how much progress we made since slavery and to now. If Black people are still vulnerable to racial injustice where they live, if they're still vulnerable to racial injustice where they learn, if they're still vulnerable to racial injustice where they work, where they heal, where they play, and where they pray, then we're still, in many ways, trapped in a world that says Black lives don't matter. So one of the ways we try to understand this from an environmental racism standpoint is that we measure justice not by when things are comfortable, when things are prosperous for us. We measure justice by, are we prepared to deal with the world around us when we have tragedy, when we experience suffering, when we experience pain? How vulnerable are we? Martin Luther King said, when America catches the cold, Black folk catch the flu. So the reality is that we measure our justice by our ability to have immunity from the same things that other folk have in America that are not Black folk. And so this is a picture of the Dome in New Orleans, where people had to seek refuge, immunity from Hurricane Katrina, because they didn't have the resources available to them to deal with the environmental injustices that happened as a result of responding to Hurricane Katrina. So I want to kind of bring us back visually into why environmental justice matters for us, is because it still deals with the spaces where we experience injustice. And in those spaces, we're more vulnerable to climate issues, environmental toxin issues, and extreme weather changes. So I'm going to show you some images now. If Black folk in New Orleans had the infrastructure in place and resiliency measures in place to endure Hurricane Katrina, then where we live would not look like this. If Black folk had the endurance in New Orleans during the time of Hurricane Katrina, then they would not have been vulnerable. If they didn't have strategic policies put in place to ensure that they experienced the worst parts of the hurricane, then their schools would not have been devastated to the degree they were. If Black people in New Orleans had the type of economic means to take care of their families and their communities, they could have built resilient communities or had an alternative plan in place to help rebuild their homes and their communities and infrastructure that was necessary after Katrina hit. And then lastly, where did they heal? Where they could not seek refuge in already a compromised medical community because their hospitals and clinics were compromised because of the flood. So they had to seek refuge outside of their own communities because they couldn't find sanctuary in their communities. Where they prayed, they couldn't seek shelter in their churches. Where they played, they couldn't seek relief from the stresses of racism. Where they found play because those areas were equally devastated during Hurricane Katrina. So what does this mean now in hindsight? We've seen environmental racism during slavery. We've seen environmental racism during Jim Crow. We've seen now environmental racism presently through the lens of the new Jim Crow, the resegregation of America, the regentrification of America, the intentional putting our frontline communities, Black communities, in harm's way when there's extreme weather. These are the things that the Black Christian Leaders Coalition is concerned about. And these things are also things that we ask that you will be concerned about as well. And we ask that you would join us and become a part of this movement to deal with what our ancestors knew was a problem and continue to fight for our future generations so they no longer have to carry the burden and the problem that we see in our communities today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Minister Saafir. And as promised last night, that was an amazing presentation and way of not only showing how Black people have always yearned for liberation in this country, but how we tied it in with our theology. And so at this time, we're going to open up the floor. Sherry, if there's any questions in the chat for Minister Saafir, we want to take an opportunity to have those questions answered. And if not questions, then comments. So Sherry, what do we have?
One comment from Dallas Conyers. He says, thank you for that, but he has to leave.
She has to leave. Thank you, Minister Conyers. Okay, any questions? Okay. I would like you to talk about a little bit more, Minister Malik, about how our theology throughout these different times is reflected in what we preached about. For example, I remember us talking one time and you saying that when we were slaves and there was no opportunity for most of us to think about prosperity or gains in the world that we were living in, that a lot of the preaching was about just hold on, you'll get yours afterwards in heaven, because that was the way that we had of people dealing with trauma, etc. So can you kind of run through that, how Black liberation theology and the conditions of Black folks were and even today still is reflected in what we hear from our pulpits?
Yes. So what we need to know is that the Black revolutionaries, the Black insurrectionists, such as Nat Turner, Delmark Vesey, David Walker, his appeal to white Christians to stop being hypocrites and start dealing with racial justice in America. The Black liberation theologians of that time, they were not called that, but we in hindsight know that they were that. They understood that they were being taught, and you think about even Nat Turner's journey, he embodied what the answer to your question. He was taught to read the Bible in a way to justify continuing to accept his oppression now and wait for deliverance in the hereafter. But when he began to rethink what he was being taught and rethink the scriptures in the way that he was reading them, he began to realize that these scriptures speak about my liberation now, not in the by and by and the hereafter. They speak about my liberation now, because Moses did not tell the children of Israel, pray while you're making bricks and God is going to deliver you in the hereafter from Pharaoh. I don't read that in the Bible. And I don't know if you got to show me that passage, Rev, if it exists. I think it's clear that the Bible speaks about deliverance in your own lifetime, in your own generation, because most people in the Bible who are being written about or spoken about, they experience freedom in their own lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, so here's the problem with the Black church. The Black church in many ways has lost its memory of liberation. It's lost its legacy of liberation, because it still in some ways has bought into the idea, by connecting itself to the white church, that liberation has to come through white institutions and white people, not through God. And so as a result of that, we separate ourselves from the history of the Black church that knew that God was the only one capable of bringing deliverance, and not through white people's hands or white institutions' hands, but through our own hands and our own institutions.
Mhm.
And I think we've lost that memory. We've lost that.
Yes, amazing, amazing. I just was thinking to myself how many times with all the wealth that the Black church has, you know, the Black church is the institution, the Black institution in the United States that has the most money, the most property, the most buildings, the most vehicles, and access to the most people. Probably is the largest publisher, and still we have so many people in the Black church who are expecting deliverance to come through, you know, a white politician, a foundation that will fund their liberation, etc. But I have one more question. We may have one more close to that. There was a shift, though. There was a shift between the Emancipation Proclamation and the Reconstruction period. There was some kind of theological shift. Something happened with Black people that made them start their own businesses, create their own towns, run for office, wind up in Congress. And to me, that's amazing, because we're not even talking about decades. But can you explain that about how our surroundings and our existence and what we go through actually actually colors how we interpret our theology and what motivates us to either stand still and do nothing or to forge forward?
Yes, so environment matters, place matters. And that's why I keep saying, you know, for people to, if they're going to rethink Black church and rethink Black liberation theology, they have to be willing to admit, and let me go back to Moses. They have to be willing to admit that their parents or their grandparents or their aunties or uncles or whoever is the one responsible for teaching them their religion, in many ways taught them a version of their religion that is a part of why they are oppressed. And they have to be willing to do what our ancestors did, is assess the situation and say, if the 14th Amendment has been passed, that gives me the right now to be protected as an American citizen from any racial injustice, then I have the law on my side, right? Mm-hmm. If the 13th Amendment, let me go back to 13th, if the 13th Amendment has been passed, that says I'm free, and then the 14th Amendment is passed, it says now I have equal protection under the law. And then you pass the 15th Amendment about voting rights, right? And so now you have all the tools and resources legally that says that now I'm capable of exercising my citizenship and now being a responsible member of my community and electing into office people that represent me and holding them accountable to now how I live out my American identity. I think during the time after slavery and Reconstruction began to have what they call the Black Reconstruction, we saw these laws being passed. These laws have always been on the book since then. And people began to hold Americans accountable to what they agreed upon, the federal government and state governments accountable to what they agreed upon. I think what we lost, once again, we'll go back to memory. A lot of Black Americans don't realize that the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the passage of the Voting Rights Act was only a reaffirmation of the legislation that was passed right after slavery. There wasn't a new legislation passed. The amendments were already there. We already had civil rights. We already had voting rights. And so we're in a situation now where we got memory issues happening. We don't remember what we always had available to us. And so we don't know how to advocate for ourselves. Now, let me deal with the church side of this. If the church was concerned about Black people, if the Black church was concerned about Black people having equal protection under the law, then any time a Black person's rights were denied under the law, the civil rights, the Black church would take to the streets and storm every state capitol and federal building in this country. Mm-hmm. If the Black church was concerned about that. the Black church was concerned about voting rights, then when someone's denied the right to vote for whatever precarious Republican agenda or Democratic agenda, they would begin to fight for that person's voting rights. If they're ex-felons or they have something on their record. I mean, so we're dealing with a time when the church, after slavery and during Reconstruction, those who were part of the liberation movement understood they had to fight for the amendments to be enforced. But now the church has kind of relaxed its standards for justice. It is no longer fighting for the same rights that the church then fought for. And that's not only with the Black church, it also goes back to Black colleges, which were founded by the Black church. Let's talk about higher education. That these amendments that were passed in the Black Reconstruction were passed to give us all the things that we need legislatively to be full Americans, and the Black church and then its founding of the Black colleges worked together to make that a possible reality. That was their mission. That's not the mission today, because we don't see the Black church nor the Black college on the front lines the way it was during that time period.
Amazing. Sherry, any questions or comments in the chat?
This is Pastor Carol.
Mm-hmm.
If I could listen, this has been fantastic. Really appreciate the dialogue and the depth of knowledge. Definitely the Black church and the history, is definitely full. I think when we talk about, and we have forgotten, I think that the church had a subversive nature in terms of the way that, we knew, but we had to kind of hide it for survival. And I think our children, we being the children, have forgotten, some of the reality of how we did spirituality and the agreements that we made in order to survive. But I think, I remember I was baptized and my mom gave me a pearly white Bible with a white Jesus. And when I went to Brazil, I saw that same Jesus. And I think when it comes to the environment, we figured that Jesus is going to take care of the planet, and Jesus is a white man. So that's not our concern. So I think that's a part of it. I think the other part, though, is not only have we forgotten, I think that there are some things that we remember about what it takes to kind of fight for justice. And we see the death and carnage on the street. We saw George Floyd be killed, but we saw Martin Luther King's, head shot off, right? And we know the cost that it takes when we really do what it is that we are called to do. And I think, people, make decisions on if they're willing to continue to pay that price. We didn't just stop, Black pastors and stuff. We didn't just stop. There was a lot of killing, lynching, and really being under siege. And I think a part of that is in our DNA, our memory as well, and sometimes keeps us immobilized. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I agree with that. And I would say that we forgot, to your point, that we forgot that there were always two fronts on the Black, or two faces of the Black church. And we let go of the subversive underground, which is what the Underground Railroad was, right? The subversive nature of the Black church. We let that go because we, in some ways, were duped. I mean, we would hoodwink,
Bamboozle.
bamboozle into thinking that we had somehow arrived after things had calmed down after the 60s and 70s. We had arrived. I mean, and we did see a significant growth in the Black middle class, but
we got paid.
Yeah, but we also saw a decline in the subversion movement that we had also established simultaneously. And I think it requires the type of sacrifice now that it did then. And I don't know, and you all, on this call or whoever is listening or watching, you all can kind of help with this. Is the Black church, this is my question, is the Black church in a position to build the type of necessary infrastructure on the above ground and underground to deal with whatever area we live in our environment. When it's threatened, we have a public response and we have a private response. And we learn how to coordinate and work those responses in tandem with one another so that we won't be undermining each other. And we also won't be being, in many ways, selling out each other for our own profit, our own gain. I think the problem with the way the Black church is set up right now is the underground movement is being, in many ways, stagnated because the so-called white liberals don't understand that they themselves had the underground movement. So the underground movement of white liberals once existed, which I think they have the same problem, because there were white folk having black folk on the Underground Railroad. That doesn't exist either. So I think we got a problem on both sides. We have a problem on both sides, because the white liberals who claim that they're for black people and for racial justice, they're the public face. They don't really represent true liberation because they don't have a counterpart to hold them accountable on their side, you know? And so I think we got to deal with that. You know, we got to deal with that. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you also, Pastor Carroll. Pastor Carroll is the founder and heads up Green the Church, which is a network of Black churches across America that deals with environmental issues and other issues. And we're happy to have you join us. And part of the reason why we're having this discussion is because we're trying to figure out what the Black church should be doing within its sacred walls. I, for one, believe, the 30 years plus that I've been doing this work around the environmental justice and climate change, etc. There are many, many, many Christians, Black Christians, who are involved in that movement because many of us, when we want to work on social justice issues, climate issues, environmental issues, couldn't do it within the walls of our church. People didn't understand, they weren't supportive. And so a lot of us wound up working with other organizations or founding our own secular organization. So I don't believe that there's a shortage of Black theological subversives. Mm-hmm. I just think that we're not united. We don't talk to one another and we don't work together with one another enough. How do you feel about that, Minister Saafir?
Well, I would say that that's true. And I would say always that we are the minority in some respect within our own churches, which is why, to your point, we look outside of the church because we don't have enough voices around us saying it's okay to be who you are. It's okay to ask these questions. It's okay to challenge the church for its lackadaisical attitude or its indifference towards what's going on in the Black community. It's okay. And I think that that's why we need organizations like B.C.L.C. And Green the Church and other Black religious organizations to say, we are here to say it's okay for you to be who you are and to fight the fight that you're fighting. Mm-hmm. And I think that the more organizations that emerge that have that capacity to affirm what people are thinking privately, I think we go back to what the way that the movement built itself was by standing up publicly and saying things and affirming things publicly that people were thinking privately. They knew it was happening. They understood that this was their reality, but they were listening to people telling them, ignore what you see, ignore what you're experiencing and believe something else. And then so people like us got to come along and say, no, what you see is true. That's the reality. Don't ignore it anymore. Now let's face it and deal with it. And so I think that helps. That helps alleviate the in many ways the disorientation that a lot of people have towards justice issues, because the church is sitting there saying, let's go back to, Jesus gonna make a way out, just pray about it, baby. Jesus gonna make a way out of no way. You know, it'll be all right in the by and by. And so we forgot the double talk. Yeah, that's what you say when you're in the company of people that you know are your oppressors. But those should be code words still to let you know that we're gonna meet after this press conference because we got some business to take care of, right?
Down by the
we got to
riverside.
understand you can use the slave talk if it's going to get you the ability to connect with other folk in the underground to organize secretly, but don't use slave talk to affirm slavery. I mean,
my Lord,
you got to go back to the sleight of hand, the double talk, you know. You know, so I mean, we got to get back.
My God.
Down by the riverside.
Yeah, we got to have another meeting for that too, right?
Swing low, sweet chariot.
Dr. If I can, I just thought about it. About 10 years ago, we went to a congregation because we were given like $5,000 for the church to, you know, do some infrastructure stuff. And one of the sisters in the meeting said, well, if we do it, are we going to have to change our Christian education? And I've always laughed at that. I was like, no, we're not going to, you don't have to change your Christian education. We're really just talking about, you know, changing out some filters and some lights and stuff, mama. But I think what people understand is when you do begin to talk about this environmental stuff, you begin to talk about God in more earthbound ways, that perhaps it is a challenge. Perhaps mother was not quite off. And I know since I've been in this work, it has definitely changed some of my theological perspectives. So maybe people see that, you know, when we start talking about being moved to do this work, that it may lend itself to a different theological lens than what we've been seeing. So.
Absolutely. Thank you to, as I said last night, to serve the present age are calling to pursue. Let me do a quick check-in. Sherry, do we have any other comments or questions in the chat?
We have a few comments, but no questions.
Okay. Can we get some of the comments, please?
Rashad says, thank you so much for your information, Malik. It was very insightful and thought-provoking. I'm motivated by this perspective you presented. Loretta says, I like that about the white people get a cold, but black people get the flu. There was a person on an iPhone that says, love that point, looking for liberation through white people when we know that that's the last thing that they want to give us.
All right, thank you for those comments. Can we do a time check, Sherry?
It's 7:51.
Okay, so we're getting close to that hour. Well, look, Minister Malik Saafir, do you have any closing remarks before we, you know, let people know what we have coming up tomorrow night with Pastor Wiggins out of New York City?
I would just say that in the same way we brought up Black liberation theology and showed how it connects to Underground Railroad and underground movement during slavery all the way up to now, we have to let our brothers and sisters who are not Black realize that in their own traditions, they have their own version of a liberation theology. And they have to find within their own tradition what's their version of a liberation theology that connects to our liberation theology so that they can partner with us, become allies with us in this struggle. Because we realize that although we can't be codependent on white institutions and white people to free us, but we also have to learn and help teach and help them learn and teach themselves how to get out of our way. And so that's a version of their own liberation theology that they have to learn and teach themselves. And so we have to be willing to think again what we've been taught, to envision another version of liberation theology for this present age. And what worked in the 1960s is not going to work in 2021.
Mm.
And so we have to all come together and go back to our own tables and our own ethnic or racial groups and begin to now rethink what liberation theology means from an eco-theology standpoint. That's my last thoughts on that.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for that, because I know some people have been upset with me in times when I say, look, I don't feel it's our job to teach our white brothers and sisters about white superiority, white power, white privilege, that they have to find their own answers and find their own ways clear. Or as you said, they have to discover their own liberation theology that frees them from their own shackles and helps them to unite with us and other people of color around the world. So thank you for that, because I've gotten a lot of pushback over the years about that, but I just feel that's their job. We can let them know when they take a misstep, but they need to discover that and do that healing and that liberation among themselves.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so thank you, and like I told folks last night, it was amazing, it was enlightening, and tomorrow night is our last night with our Earth Week, and our person tomorrow night will be Pastor Esther Wiggins from First Faith Baptist Church in Queens, New York. And some of you who have been on the call know how close I feel to Pastor Wiggins, because it was her father who helped to mentor me when I was new in the ministry. And so you just figure that was like 37 years ago. And a lot of what I know, a lot of what I do, I contribute to him, and I thank God for him and for his daughter who is continuing his work. So Pastor Wiggins will be with us tomorrow, and tomorrow is art and culture night for Earth Week. And so we have some amazing young people. Amber Hayes is going to be here. She's a young artist, teenage artist. She's going to be talking about her work, what motivates her. And we have praise dancers, and we have singers, we have spoken word, and we want you to join us while we celebrate, because we've always managed to celebrate regardless of our condition, regardless of whatever pain we've been suffering and going through. So we thank you all for coming. Sherry, one more time, check.
7:56.
7:56, thank you. So we're gonna close with that. Pastor Carol, let's you and I connect offline, okay? He's still with us?
I think he had to jump off.
Okay, he jumped off. I'll connect with him. I
Yes,
want to
sir.
thank him.
I hear you. Bless you,
What
Doc.
was that?
I appreciate your work. I said,
Okay,
this
same
is
here.
Ambrose Carroll. Thank
Yeah.
you, Doc. I appreciate your work. Yeah, let's get it together.
Yeah, let's get together so we can coordinate this thing. Ambrose is all the way in California, so we can have a West Coast connection, right? Amen. So I was going to ask you, Pastor Carol, if you give us a short prayer to close us out, and then I know we're going to close out like as we have every night with one of the songs that Minister Saafir has chosen to close us out with. So if you give us a brief prayer, Pastor Carol, and we'll have our closing song. And if the Lord tarries, we'll see you back tomorrow.
Dear Master, we thank you for the beauty and bliss of this day. We thank you for the spring of the year. We thank you for hope that has not died. Continue to hold us in the hollow of your hand. Lead us in the way that you would have us to go. Thank God and amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you all. God bless you. Stay safe. Stay blessed while we have our closing selection. See you tomorrow, God willing. Good night, saints.
Bye.
Good night.
So long, stay strong.
Yeah, thank y'all. Same to you, Mr. Frank. Thank everybody.